Alexa, play the universal intro music. The oh-so-mythical trend cycle. I'm sure you've heard of it. It always comes back every 100, 30, 20, 10, 1 years. And while there is no exact cycle to track, there definitely are repetitive things that are happening throughout history with fashion. So, in this video, I wanted to try and put that to a visual sense. I'm a visual learner, so why not? The way I think of the trend cycle is a sort of spiral more than anything else. The further we move in time, the tighter the circle gets, and the more often trends are created and repeated. So today I've made a sort of roadmap that is a timeline of eras and periods of fashion throughout history and up to the modern day that I've then imposed some trends on to see how they dip in and out of fashion throughout the timeline. I suppose my hope for this project is to see that at least once in every period of time I have listed, there is a trend that is repeated. So at the end of this, I hope to not have any blank spots left. Before we further any ados, let's get started. Here is our timeline. This is what we'll be tracking 1,000 years of trends through, starting with the medieval period, which on our timeline spans from about the year 1000 to roughly 1400. The Renaissance, which spans roughly 1300 to 1600, depending on who you ask. The Tudor period, which was the reign of Henry V, Queen Elizabeth, etc. You know, the freaks of England. Love you, Lizzie, but Henry, you can go eat it. 17th century, which has no cool name in European history. Instead, the closest I could find was the start of Japan's Edo period. So, I've just written down 17th century, but in my heart, it is Japan's Edo period, but in Europe. The 18th century, could call it Georgian, could call it other things. I'm calling it the 18th century. Then, we move out of centuries and larger time spans into specific eras. The Regency period, the Victorian era, which I have divided into early, middle, and late, the Edwardian era, and then we get into specific decades, 1920s all the way through to the year 2020. I'm going to list out some trends. We're going to see just how far they track through history and where they dip and where they rise. If it rises, it'll be closer to the label. If it dips, it'll be closer to this center line. So without further ado, let's start tracking 1,000 years of trends. The hourglass figure. When tracking the hourglass figure, we can start in the medieval period. Towards the end of medieval times, people were discovering that you could cut curves into large swaths of fabric instead of working with rectangles and squares to create something that hugs the body. This was, of course, more expensive and so was more commonly only seen on the rich and noble. We then have a huge jump over the following centuries as a conical shape is prioritized, but we come back to the hourglass figure in the Victorian period, where we see the height of curvy corsetry come into play. This continues on through the Edwardian period, still prioritizing that hourglass figure with slight variations. Really going for, as one of the great philosophers of our time has said, body crazy, curvy waist, big little waist, body yaddy yaddy yaddy. We skip over the 20s and 30s as it becomes a little shapeless, a little more shapely, and then we hit the 1940s, where a feminine silhouette is really coming into play through to the 1950s. But once we hit the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, this whole period of time, it's not really prioritized. It's seen, but not prioritized, especially the 90s and 2000s, while they have a lot of body image issues. Looking like a ruler was preferable and okay rather than looking curvy. Then in the 2010s, we reach the last real peak of the hourglass figure, as in the 2020s, body figure and silhouette varies rapidly and is also trying to lean towards body positivity. But in the 2010s, it really became the point of fashion to alter your body to fit the hourglass shape rather than your clothing. A medieval aesthetic. Medieval aesthetics did quite obviously start in the medieval period, but we had a huge jump until we get to the Victorian era. In the middle of the Victorian era, there was, especially in art movements, but also in fashion, a romanticization of the medieval period and ye olden times, Arthurian legend and such. It drops out of fashion again until we hit the 1960s and 70s, where there's this odd things that happen with folk music, where it takes on what Rachel Maxi coins as mod evil, and it blends pretty seamlessly with hippie aesthetics as well. We have a huge jump again over the end of the century, and then it comes back in the 2020s as sort of a leftover of the cottagecore aesthetic, as well as blending into a witchy aesthetic as well. And my favorite latest trend has been girls' nights, where you and your girls get together and make yourself hennins. High-waist dresses can be found in the medieval period, especially in the style known as a houppelande. This was a sort of wrap dress that sat just below the bust and was common amongst noble women. Then in the Renaissance, we see dresses that hit mid-rib cage and don't quite hit the natural waist yet, but they do once we hit the Tudor period and stay near or at the natural waist all the way through to the Regency. In Regency, we see the highest of high-waisted dresses. After high-waisted dresses reach their, height, they fall back again in the Victorian period, slowly through the early period towards the middle, and have a small spike in the later Edwardian period, think Titanic era, when dresses hit mid-rib cage again. The waist becomes shapeless and then hits the natural waist once again, all throughout the following century, except for another dip in the 90s. Empire waist dresses do have quite a moment in the 90s, and it doesn't really come back with a huge prevalence again for the rest of our timeline, which I do find surprising because in the 2020s, Bridgerton was such a craze, but it never really affected fashion in that way. Bell sleeves. We see the origin of bell sleeves in the medieval period with these long flowing sleeves that can go almost to the ground, or even in some cases dragging on the ground, draping from the wrist or the elbow, and then we skip over it in the Renaissance, but come back in the Tudor period with these bell-shaped sleeves going from the elbow to the wrist that could be done in an alternate fabric, the same dress fabric, or even fur, but we don't see them again until the mid-Victorian period. In the 1860s, there was a specific type of sleeve called the pagoda sleeve, which was a long bell-shaped sleeve that went from shoulder to wrist with its bell and was very popular. We then have a 100-year jump to the 60s. Oh no! The 70s have fallen. Ow! Stab myself. The 60s, where bell sleeves come back into that mod-evil hippie aesthetic. In the 1970s, we see this come really into fashion with Stevie Nicks wearing bell sleeves on stage. We then skip over it for the rest of the century, but it does come back in the 2020s with the medieval revival and the 70s revival as well. Big puffed sleeves. There are puff sleeves almost everywhere in history, so for this subject I am only doing truly massive puffed sleeves. And we're starting in the Renaissance with this, with some slash and puff sleeves that are monstrously shaped, and then we skip over the Tudor period into the 17th century where we see more examples of these absolutely massive puffed sleeves. We skip over the 18th century where sleeves become much closer to the arm except for big cuffs on the bottom in some cases, and we skip over the Regency period because there have been puffed sleeves in this period, but they're not massive, they're just little puffs. In the early Victorian period, I'm talking 1830s here, there are ridiculous puffed sleeves going on, but it falls out of fashion in the mid-Victorian period and then comes back with the leg of mutton sleeve in the very, very end of the Victorian period into the Edwardian period. And we don't see puff sleeves again until we hit the 1980s, where everything is bigger and the higher the hair, the closer to God. So apparently the bigger the sleeves, the better the something? I don't know, someone who was alive in the 80s, come up with something for me. And we don't really see puff sleeves come back into fashion until we hit the 2020s, where we once again have cottagecore coming into style, as well as some weird avant-garde things that are happening in higher fashion houses and things like that. And I can't say that I'm too mad about it. Next, hip flare. I'm cheating a little bit by starting hip flare in the Tudor period here, because in the late Tudor period there was something called a French farthingale, or a drum farthingale as modern historians call it, and it wasn't just flared at the hips, it was flared all around. It was basically a circle. It looked like a drum. But it does have more emphasis on the hips than other things we've seen, so I'm starting it there. Fight with me in the comments, I dare you. I will probably lose because I'm not good at cyberbullying, but hey, I'll try. We skip over hip flare in the 17th century, but come right back to it in the 18th century with the advent of the pannier, which, I mean, if you think about like Marie Antoinette in your mind, you think big hair, you think let them eat cake, and then you think, oh my gosh, hips don't lie. But after the 18th century, we don't see it come back until the 1920s, well over 100 years later. In the 1920s, there was a very specific type of dress called the robe de style. And the robe de style could either just be a bit of gathering at the hips, or it could be an understructure a lot like panniers. And it wasn't an everyday dress, but it was a fashionable item. Our flared hips take another 100 years to come back, though, in ye old 2020s. In the past few years, I have seen a number of dresses that, oddly enough, match very well with solo hip flare. Flat front, flat back, flared hips. And I'm here for it. The prairie dress. In the mid-Victorian era, the prairie dress was born out of necessity when it came to exploring and settling the great American West. This was usually a dress that was efficiently made and was on the cheaper side of things, as this was a common folks' dress. However, it was still pretty in its simplicity and its minimal adornment. But the cuts and styles of the mid-Victorian period did fall out of fashion, and we don't see this come back until all the way down in the 1970s. In the 70s, there was a hippie movement, right? But there was also a lot of revival going on, and prairie dresses were a part of that, specifically gunny sack dresses. This bled into the 1980s a bit, but quickly disappeared into the 90s and 2000s. We had a brief stint with this in Western sort of fashion with the 2010s, but not prairie specific, so I haven't included it here. In the 2020s, the gunny sack dress is the holy grail of thrift finds nowadays, and is definitely something to brag about to your friends. Athleisure. In the late Victorian period, athletic clothing and everyday clothing started to mash together with the practice of cycling. The cycling skirt was a great invention that meant that you could cycle and look presentable the minute you were done with that. So that's like the first piece of athleisure we have, which is pretty cool and continues on through every single decade. We see more and more pieces that double as athletic wear or more comfortable wear that you could be athletic in, and everyday clothing. We see this with Edwardian dresses that have special corsets and panels in them for playing tennis and badminton with your friends. We see this through the 20s, 30s, and 40s with different types of sweaters and elasticated clothing that is for ease of movement. And of course, this goes through the rest of the century as we see more elastic and spandex being incorporated into clothing, as well as in the 90s and 2000s, the popularity of wearing tracksuits. In the 2010s and 2020s, it is no surprise to just see someone out on the street in leggings and a sports bra. They could be going to get a coffee, they could be going for a run, or hey, they could just be going out for a walk to go to the movies. Who knows? No one. The slip dress. The first time we see a slip not be solely underwear is in the 1920s, when it starts to peek through dresses. While it's not worn solely as a dress on its own, overdresses in the 20s could just be entirely sheer fabric, so you're wearing your slip out, but it's barely covered. In the 30s, a bias cut gown that is very like a slip starts to come into fashion, especially with the old Hollywood aesthetic that we know of, and this continues a little bit into the 40s, but it isn't quite a slip dress anymore and is more just bias cut gowns. We then skip over most of the 20th century until we get to the 90s, where the slip dress becomes very prevalent in fashion and disappears again into the 2000s and 2010s. It exists, but it's not the popular choice. And we've seen a return to the slip dress in the 2020s, especially this style, which is to wear a slip dress over a t-shirt. I kind of dig it. It's weird, but I dig it. The wrap dress. While we see variations on wrap-style dresses throughout history, a true dress that is obviously wrapped and tied to one side becomes pretty popular in the 1940s, especially as it's easy to make if you're making your own clothes at home, especially during World War II, where you may have to make do with what you can. This style continues to be popular throughout the 20th century, with a brief hop away from it in the 1990s, as we don't see a lot of wrap dresses going on then, and we come back to see it in the 2000s as a simple staple dress in many women's closets, and though it is existing for the rest of our timeline, it's not popular, so I've let it fall out in the 2000s. The swing dress. We see the origins of swing dresses, specifically made for dancing, in the 40s and 50s, and then we don't see it pop up again until the 1980s, when the 80s had a thing where it was very 80s does 50s. I own several dresses that are 50s dresses, but actually they were made in the 80s. We see a skip over this style in the 90s, and then coming back a little bit in the 2000s with Amy Winehouse, and in the 2010s with a rockabilly aesthetic. We see it in the 2020s, but it's not a prevalent fashion choice, though it is popular among vintage enthusiasts like myself. Skinny jeans. Skinny jeans, first seen in the 50s, look like straight leg jeans to us, but it's the skinniest jeans I've ever been, so skinny jeans. Started with rock stars and continued with rock stars into the 1960s. Then comes the curse of the bell bottoms in the 1970s. I don't actually mean that. Bell bottoms are really cool. And we don't see skinny jeans come to popularity again until the 1980s, once again with rock stars and with the punk movement. We skip in the 1990s as boot cuts reign supreme, as well as baggy jeans and Jankos. We come back in the 2000s. Boot cuts are still super popular, but if you were an emo or an alt kid, then you absolutely were wearing a pair of skinny jeans. Same can be said for the 2010s. Speaking from experience, if you wanted to be a wannabe kind of alt person in any way, you were wearing a pair of skinny jeans. This is kind of where skinny jeans lose prevalence, is in the 2010s, as they're still being worn in the 2020s, but they're not the dominant jean that we see. We often see straight legs or flares nowadays, and mom jeans came back from the 80s as well in the 2020s. Speaking of jeans, low-rise. The year is 1993, and apparently your hip bones must be seen. Low-rise jeans are absolutely it in the 90s, and they continue to be it through the 2000s. In the 2010s, though, high waist reigns supreme. If your zipper is not 9 inches long and the button is not hitting your belly button, you're doing it wrong. However, after our jump over the 2010s, we see the return of low-rise in 2020, where the body positivity movement is embracing the muffin top. Maxi skirts. In the 1960s, the maxi skirt was the alternative to the miniskirt, and it remained popular through the hippie movement of the 70s. While it existed in the 80s, it wasn't prevalent, so we're going to jump over that and hit the 1990s, where maxi skirts come back into popularity, especially on red carpets, though minis are popular as well. This continues through the 2000s with a hump over 2010, as maxi skirts are there, but they're not prevalent in any way, and then coming back full force in the 2020s, where I now cannot walk to the grocery store without seeing at least 10 maxi skirts before I get there. Mod. The mod style prioritizes strong lines and strong color, which we can see clearly in the 1960s, where it has its origins. This moves on and skips over a few decades to come back in the 1990s, especially with Chanel runway looks. We then have another skip over the 2000s to come back in the 2010s just a little bit in some of those more blocky looks that we see with very defined color palette. The miniskirt. We see the birth of the miniskirt in the 1960s, and it hits every decade as a trend through the rest of the centuries. In the 1970s, early days, it was more popular as it was in the late 60s, but not quite as popular with the hippie trends as it was with the punks in the 80s. The punks in the 80s, as well as alternative movements, loved to show off. And so mini skirts, bold colors, things like that, absolutely were a thing. In the 90s, it's either a belt or a skirt, and I don't know which. And that is truly all I can say. That continues a little bit into the 2000s and then into the 2010s with the high-waisted miniskirt, which if you wore it at the low hips like you would in the 90s, it would probably hit your knees, but since in the 2010s we're wearing it at the natural waist, it only hits mid-thigh. Then, of course, we jump into the 2020s, where 90s and Y2K revival is making a full comeback with itty-bitty, teeny-tiny little skirts. And last but not least, the subject I want to talk about is that everyone wanted to show off their underwear. It is my firm stance that people have been showing off their underwear since the beginning of time, and I am here to prove it. With 1,000 years ago, people in the medieval period had their kirtles, or their underdress, showing through at the cuffs, through the lacing gaps, and at the top of their garments. They would even decorate it to make sure that it looked nice if and when it peeked out. It was just a fact of life that you were going to see it. This is true of the Renaissance as well, with peaks of the shift coming through in sleeve gaps and at the top of garments. The same can be said for the Tudor period and the 17th century. We see less of this in the 18th century and the Victorian era. However, we do see this in the Edwardian period with lingerie dresses, because insertion lace, which is quite literally something that is meant to be see-through, could show your corset cover and your various undergarments and petticoats underneath. As we discussed earlier, in the 1920s, it was no shock to see a slip through a dress, even though a slip at this point was more of an undergarment than an outer garment. Through the 1930s and 40s, we don't see a lot of underwear, but in the 1950s, we see petticoats. Petticoats are technically underwear, and were specifically made to look pretty because they were seen. We don't see a lot of underwear in the 60s and 70s. We see a little bit of it with punk movements in the 80s, but we fully are seeing underwear in the 1990s. Not only do bras peek out the tops of your tank tops, but if you're wearing baggy jeans, I guarantee you that you are going to see some waistband slip there. All it takes is one misstep, and then you've got Mr. Calvin Klein giving you a low wave. In the 90s and into the 2000s, the very low-waisted pants that everyone was wearing led to a trend called whale tails, which was specifically to show your underwear straps coming up over the top of your jeans. As we move into the 2010s, it's no surprise that athleisure plays a part in this, because wearing a sports bra outside every day is not strange at all. And in the 2020s, with our Y2K revival, it's once again a trend to have your thong straps come up over the hips. Of course, the trend is less focused on the back of the underwear as it was in the 2000s and 90s, and is more focused on the hip lines. It's also kind of a thing in the 2020s to wear a bra over top a t-shirt, or have a t-shirt with a bra printed on it. So yeah, people have been showing off their underwear for 1,000 years. Woof. That was a lot of talking, but I do believe that I reached my goal. I found at least one trend for every era that is either repeated or will be repeated throughout the timeline. I am pretty pleased as punch, and also I've always wanted to have a giant, conspiracy theory board, and I think that this was the perfect opportunity to do that. I think my videos tend to fall into the categories of either making things or talking about history or media and reporting on it. So being able to do something that's I feel like this is when you get assigned a diorama in the 2nd grade, It's different. It's fun. I enjoyed it a lot. And I think that it's really important to be able to recognize similarities throughout history, as understanding the past informs the future, and looking at the present with the lens of the past can help you see where things are going, in fashion, in life, in many things. I hope you guys found this video as entertaining as it was for me to make it. If you want to see more like this, be sure to visit my channel. I have lots of videos of me making historical garments and fantasy garments, as well as talking about history, fantasy, and media. If your attention span is not feeling up to YouTube, then maybe check out my Instagram or my TikTok. And if you feel like supporting the channel, maybe go check out my Patreon. I hope you have a great day or night or whenever you happen to be watching this, and bye! I'm being defeated by tape. Best tape peeler in the West. My videos tend to Rude. And continue with